country music was so different in those days, in the 60s and the 70s. And people operated out of their back pocket, man.
Sure, you'd go out to play a concert, and you would agree with the promoter on how much he was going to pay you and all. You'd get there. If you had a good crowd, you'd usually get paid if he was honest. And you didn't have a good crowd, he'd come to you with a sob story about the fact his kids hadn't eaten in a month and wore holes in their shoes.
And usually it worked.
And you'd work a deal. I remember one time, you've probably done this too. We played a show in Florida one night. And the promoter was not a real nice man. He'd given us a hard time all night long. He'd not been very gracious or anything. And then he ran off and didn't pay us at the end of the show. We found out where he lived. And we drove our big old bus right out to his house and pulled in his driveway behind his car. Went up and knocked on the door because he wouldn't come to the door. Well, we didn't have anywhere to go. So I said, boys, we're going to spend the night right here. Just go bunk down. And if he wants to get out of his driveway tomorrow, the next day, whenever it is,
a week from now,
we'll talk to him. And the next morning, about 9 o'clock or so, he comes out and we're still sitting in his drive and he can't move. And he went back in the house and got the money and paid us. But you had to do that. Can you imagine that happening today?
No, ridiculous.
I can't imagine it happening then.
I can't imagine the fact that you said we used to all get paid in cash and carrying that kind of cash.
Oh, yeah. Well, you didn't trust any. You didn't trust a check.
No.
I mean, most of the people you wouldn't take a check from.
And the funny way the funny events that you said about how the different ways of taking you off stage and bringing you on stage. I love the one where Cracker Jim, in his monotone voice, everything he said was everything he announced was monotone. Yeah. Tell about that.
Well, I told the story in there about the time that I was on the show. This was in Miami, Florida, and the disc jockey's name was Cracker Jim, and Farron Young was on the show, and Farron had not gotten there, and so Cracker Jim goes out on the opening, but Farron's not going on until late. You know, he's not going on until 10 o'clock, and it's like 8 o'clock, and there are other acts, and Jim goes out and he panics, and he starts telling the crowd that Farron is not there. And the crowd, he might as well turn the hose on.
Oh, the worst thing in the world to tell people.
And I was on just before Farron was to come on, and he walked out there, and by this time Farron had just come in. And Cracker Jim walks out, and he says, folks, the great Farron Young is here. Yes, he's here. In a minute, you're going to be entertained by the great Farron Young. In the meantime, here's Bill Anderson. Bill? I heard him introduce Ernest Tubb one time. He said, here's Ernest Tubb, and I hope you get a large charge. And you've got to go out there and work. Oh. And the crowd is not on your side. Did you read the one about the lady that forgot my name when she went to introduce me?
Yes.
She stood on the stage and she was trying to think, who is it? I know his name, I can't think of it. And finally, I wasn't going to help her. She kept looking over at me like, tell me who you are. And I'm standing there going, mm-mm. So finally she says, come on out here, boy, and tell them who you are.
That happened to me one time. One time I was emceeing a show. I was on the show and I also was emceeing. And there was everybody was on it. And I hated emceeing anyway, because I'm thinking of 1,000 things and the promoter's pushing on time and you're running late. And I went out to introduce the act, and I went totally blank. I mean, my mind was nothing. There was a blackboard there with no writing on it anywhere. And I took the microphone and said, I've always wanted to do this, folks. You bring him on. And held the microphone to the crowd, and of course they knew
who was next.
They shouted his name. That's right.
We'll just do like Grandpa Jones. If he forgets on the Opry all the time. He went to do Jumpin' Bill Carlisle the other night, and he said, well, here's Jumpin' Jim Carlisle.
He's only known him 100 years.
He called Martina McBride Matilda McBride.
Thank you so much for coming all the way over here to do Heart to Heart. We love you, and it's so good to see you.
Thank you for having me. I have enjoyed it tremendously.
Love your music and your artistry. You are truly a role model for country music.
For incorrigibles.
For people that's going to shoot their own pants. Do a little dab.
I don't have enough fans to shoot. Let's do it. We was poor folks living in a rich folks world. We sure was a hungry bunch. If the wolf had ever come to our front door, he'd have had to brought a picnic lunch. But we had something in our house money can't buy. Kept us warm in the winter and cool when the sun was high. For whenever we didn't have food enough and the howling winds would get pretty rough, we patched the cracks. We set the table with love, and that's important.
That's very important.
Because that's what you do when you're poor.